Today we're going to do a little history making and review some of the history of our relationship with the nuclear bomb. And my speaker today, my guest, is Lawrence Whitner, who's a professor emeritus of history at the State University of New York at Albany. And although he only lives a few hundred miles away, I haven't seen him in, I think, 40 years. So, of course, we're getting acquainted again as we reminisce about the olden days when we both were in the streets more often than in our classrooms, or at least giving talks in various clubs and churches and things like that. The days of the campaign against nuclear weapons in the 1980s. And Larry, if I may call you that again,
Sure.
wrote in those days a wonderful 3-volume book called The Struggle Against the Bomb, which somebody had the wisdom to try to compile into a 1-volume version called Confronting the Bomb. And I have all 3 of the original volumes on my shelf in the other room, and remember with great fondness reading them originally.
Oh, thank you.
So, hello, Larry. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you, Meta?
Doing well, yes. And it's going to be fun getting back onto our preoccupation, which in my case has never diminished. I still think and worry about nuclear weapons as much as any topic. How about you?
Oh, certainly. I actually first encountered them as a child when in the New York City public school system, I would hide under my desk at the time when the teacher would say, take cover. These were nuclear bomb test drills. And I was always a big, gangly kid. So I would bang my elbows and knees as I got under my little desk.
That's interesting because everybody else has hidden under their desk, but I never did. My terror was hearing the sirens because every month they would test the nuclear siren to indicate that the bombs were on the way, the bombers in those days.
Mhm.
And I would go into a total, adrenaline rush like you wouldn't believe, like a meltdown. And other people would sort of ignore it. And it happens, as a matter of fact, this is kind of the topic that I hope we'll talk about mostly today, is what I would call denial. Maybe there's a less pejorative way of describing it, but the reluctance that people have to actually come to terms with and believe in the reality and the seriousness of the threat that nuclear weapons pose. But I remember working in a bank, and the siren went off at the wrong time. It wasn't the usual noontime Friday thing. It was some other time, and it was really the siren. And so I went to my boss and said, what's this about? What should we do? It's nothing. Don't worry. And it was, it really had been a false alarm. And another time I was living in Southern California and the things went off. And again, I was alone at that time, but there was no reaction. People ignored it. Well, thank God they were right to ignore it in that case, because it was a false alarm. But, one of these days, it won't be a false alarm, unfortunately. And I know you've given a lot of thought to it. So is this something that you have written about even, this reluctance to engage with nuclear weapons as a continuing threat?
Well, yes, and I think it's a very important phenomenon. I think one of the major problems is that if I think Freud had said that the thing that people least want to think about is their forthcoming death. Uh, and imagine having to think about not only your death, but the death of all the people you love and you know, and the world's population, and all the animals and the plants, all turned into a charred, smoking, radioactive ruin. Uh, so I think people, to maintain their own sanity or uh, uh, sense of purpose or reason to go on, just put the reality of nuclear danger onto the back burner of their brain, and they don't want it up front or confronting them every day. So it's with great reluctance that people are willing to even think about nuclear weapons.
Well, some are and some aren't. I mean, I think about dying many times a day. And I've talked to my friends and said, "How often do you think about it?" And they'll talk about once a month or something like
Oh,
that. I mean, I'm conscious all the time, almost, that life is very fragile and temporary. And I don't know why there would be any difference between people in their willingness to recognize that. But you're probably right. That's probably because the thing that disaster sociologists report most frequently is two things. Number one is if you warn people that there's a disaster about to happen and they better do something quick to save themselves, most people will ignore it. Or many people, I don't know the numbers, but it's very, very common to have people just shrug it off. And the other thing is that if you tell government officials to prepare for a disaster, and that a disaster has a certain probability or even great probability, they will say, no, we don't want to frighten people. They will go into a panic. And so we must disguise the truth. Even if we know the truth, even if we acknowledge the truth, we mustn't tell the public. And so they lie about things. And this is so common that it's universal, may as well say.
hmm. Well, certainly government officials have gone to great lengths, particularly officials in nuclear armed nations, to avoid frightening their publics about nuclear weapons, among other reasons, because a frightened public might demand that nuclear weapons be abolished rather than maintained and upgraded as part of a nuclear arms race. So from a fairly early date, the U.S. government began to downplay the nuclear threat and viewed a public concern with it as a real danger to its nuclear weapons program.
Mhm. Well, of course, there's also the logic of the notion of deterrence. They make an argument. You can't. I don't like their argument, but you can't say it's not a real logical argument.
Mhm.
And people, I guess, do need to understand. Well, it's a notion of deterrence.
Right, right. Well, I think that there are various reasons um, that lead people to oppose building a nuclear weapons free world or getting rid of nuclear weapons. Um, that is, when they do confront the nuclear issue, they oppose it. Most people don't happen to have that view, by the way. The polls show that most people, when asked by opinion pollsters, whether or not they support nuclear disarmament or building a nuclear weapons free world. Most people prefer disarmament and building a nuclear weapons free world. But there's a substantial minority, you're quite correct, that don't want to get rid of nuclear weapons. One group is composed of people who are, at least in the nuclear power, such as the United States, who are working in the nuclear industry, and that's a major industry in the United States, and it's undergone a major revival during the Trump administration, the so-called nuclear modernization program. Um, so for those people, it means getting rid of their jobs and incomes, and therefore they're a lobbying force against getting rid of nuclear weapons. They don't want their factories closed down. Uh, a second group, I guess we could say, is composed of people who have aggressive impulses that are manifested in nationalism or in bullying other people or other nations. And they want nuclear weapons as a way of asserting their power and their dominance. I guess Theodore Adorno would put them fairly high on the F scale, the authoritarian personality. And then there's the group that you're referring to, which may be the largest yet of the nuclear weapons retainers. And they're convinced by the argument of nuclear deterrence. What they say is, well, yes, nuclear weapons are dangerous, and we hope they're never used, but they prevent war and they prevent nuclear war. So we need nuclear weapons as a guarantor of peace, and certainly a protection against being attacked by another nuclear armed nation.
Mm-hmm. And they can make a case.
Yes.
They can make a case. They say, well, if we hadn't had nuclear weapons, probably the Soviet Union would have gone to war against at least the U.S. and probably a bunch of other Western countries. And how do you prove that that's not so? I don't know.
Yeah. How do you prove it is so, though?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the worst
Ronald,
is, I mean, I think probably deterrence certainly works sometimes. I remember, I think of deterrence as just warning somebody that if they do something you don't like, you will make them regret it. And I, as a parent, remember warning my child that, if you don't do what I want you to do, if you disobey me, I'm going to punish you,
right,
and you will be sorry.
right,
And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And
right,
the only question I have is, if I were using a nuclear weapon against him.
right. Yes. Well, Ronald Reagan was confronted by that deterrence claim, that deterrence worked, while he was president. But after he had decided that he was going to support nuclear disarmament, that is, after he had turned from a hawk to a dove when it came to nuclear weapons, and he was propounding the need to eliminate nuclear weapons, when one of his key officials countered that by saying, well, we have to have nuclear weapons, Mr. President, because that's the only thing that has ever prevented the Soviet Union from invading Western Europe. And Reagan replied, how do you know that? and of course he didn't. So even Reagan was willing to question the whole notion of nuclear deterrence. Furthermore, just logically, we can ask, well, why is the United States so worried about Iran getting nuclear weapons if nuclear deterrence worked? That is why. Why doesn't the United States, having this vast nuclear arsenal, prevent other countries from using nuclear weapons? Well, obviously, the US government doesn't think that its possession of nuclear weapons works, and therefore it wants no nuclear weapons in Iran.
Well, logically, it would make sense that if nuclear weapons protect the peace, we
Right,
should hope that every country should have nuclear weapons so that we'd really have peace.
right, right.
I mean,
But they never say that.
No, it's only we get to have the nuclear weapons. Well,
Right.
I'm U.S. and Canadian citizen, so I can wear my American identity when saying we. Canada, as living in as a Canadian, I can't say our nuclear weapons, except that as part of NATO, Canada is complicit in and on board with the use of nuclear weapons as a threat and even potential real use. There's no policy of no first use, for example.
Right. Although Canada did have possession of nuclear weapons, of U.S. NATO nuclear weapons for years until in the 1970s, I believe.
Mhm.
They were finally withdrawn at the Canadian government's insistence.
Mhm. Yeah.
So Canada has backed off in part from being a nuclear complicit nation.
Well,
It's no longer nuclear armed in any case.
maybe I've been chasing a mystery, and I should warn people this is completely apocryphal, don't believe a word I say kind of story. I'm telling you the truth, but it's about something that is very questionable. So I should preface it that way. I gave a talk at a church once, and a man came up to me and he said, "Did you know that in Cold Lake, Alberta, there's a big crater or a something in the ground where American nuclear weapons had been tested underground, exploded?" And I certainly didn't know that. I don't fact I to this day I don't really believe it. But he said, if you go to such and such an encyclopedia, it was called American something or other encyclopedia, you will see a photo of this thing, and the caption under it says, "This is a crater or something, the place where an American nuclear bomb was tested underground." So I went to the library and I looked, and they didn't have that edition of the particular encyclopedia. And I pursued it, in my spare time, quite a long time. And of course, I never found it. And that's why I say I don't believe it. But on the other hand, I sort of do. I kind of wonder, have you ever heard of anything like that?
No, I haven't. My um, understanding of the history of nuclear weapons testing is that the United States tested plenty of its nuclear weapons in Nevada and in the Pacific, in the islands or at the islands um, that were a trust territory for the United States. The United States.
Marshall, mostly.
Yes, right, right. The United States had gotten possession of them thanks to its victory against Japan. They were placed under U.S. Governance, became a trust territory, and so the U.S. government decided to use them to test its nuclear weapons. Uh, and in part thanks to the fact that the people in Nevada were growing dismayed at the nuclear tests there and the growing radioactivity. So the US government preferred testing them in the Pacific.
I remember in early 1961, going out in the front yard of my parents' house at some before dawn with my baby, I was infant at that time, to watch the blast from the test site in Nevada, but I can't think of where.
I think probably so. I remember seeing that too.
Yeah. And, thinking back on it, it was just an interesting thing to see. But I'm glad the wind wasn't blowing my way, because the wind did blow and it did carry that stuff, and it damaged herds of sheep. And I think there are people who were seriously impaired by the fallout.
Oh, absolutely. The whole question of nuclear testing, certainly atmospheric nuclear testing, um, became a very hot one in the 1950s and early 1960s. The Nobel Prize winner Linus Pauling was a particularly effective advocate or proponent of the theory that 1 million people would die from the radioactive fallout, and there were major campaigns developed around the idea of stopping nuclear testing. That's how the National Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy got going in the United States in 1957. And the Canadian Committee Against Radiation Hazards, which became Canadian CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, got going in Canada. Um, that that concern about nuclear fallout diminished very significantly after the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, when the nuclear powers and others began to sign on to this treaty that banned nuclear testing in the atmosphere or underwater. But tests still continued underground, of course.
They continued for a long time. I don't think they've been doing any for, well, they in effect haven't ever signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but they've been basically abiding by it.
For the most part, yes. North Korea, which was a signatory to it, I believe. No, to non-proliferation treaty. I'm thinking, but in any case, North Korea did test nuclear weapons more recently, and the Indian and the Pakistani governments conducted underground nuclear tests.
I was thinking of the U.S. because
Oh no, the U.S. government hasn't tested nuclear weapons since 1991.
Right, and yet they don't sign it. I don't know what is so difficult for the U.S. population to give up nuclear weapons officially by signing either the Comprehensive Test Ban or now the ban treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But it seems that not a single one of the nuclear armed states has any intention whatever politically of joining that convention or that treaty.
Yes, well, when the UN was discussing this treaty and debating it, and finally, when the nation signed it back in 2017, the representatives of the U.S., British, and French government made a public. Well, first the nuclear powers objected to UN consideration of this treaty in the first place. And then the US, British, and French government representatives who had been boycotting the negotiations announced that their countries would never sign this treaty. And in fact, they haven't, nor have the other nuclear powers signed it. I do think, well, also, I should just add that the mass communications media in these countries and around the world, for the most part, have been very quiet about this UN treaty on the prohibition of weapons. So most people have never heard of that treaty. Polls have shown, though, that in nations around the world, most people or strong pluralities of people, nations around the world, support signing that treaty. In the United States, where again, most people never heard of it, the pollsters found that 49% of respondents favored signing it. 32% of respondents were opposed to signing it, and the rest didn't know. So again, opposition isn't that great, but governments are very hostile to it. They don't want to get rid of their nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we think we have a democracy, but there's absolutely no impact. Well, there's no impact of public opinion on that issue because the public, although they have an opinion, are not exercised about the opinion now.
Right.
You know,
They're not
if they got
mobilized.
really emphatic about saying, we really mean this, you know, snap to it and do it, then
Right.
we'd have a different action. About 10 years ago or less, I went through every public record I could find on the internet about polls that ask questions about, would you like to see nuclear weapons abolished or banned completely? And every country, I found, oh, at that point, I'm exaggerating, I don't know, 20 different polls, something up close to that. At least some of the polls had many different countries that they polled. And there were only two cases in which any country fell below 50%. One was Israel, and it was just a little below 50% approval for abolition of nuclear weapons. And the other one was briefly Pakistan. Uh, Apart from that, in every other country, and there must have been at least 20 records of that I found at that point. Every other country was well above 50% wanting to abolish nuclear weapons and ban them. And Canada was in the order of, I don't know, 75%, something like that, because Canada was several times polled. Right now, there's a movement afoot here to put another question of that kind onto one of the national polls. So we'll see. Uh, what gets it contaminated in Canada? If you ask the question by itself, you'll get one kind of answer. If you ask it in connection with the notion of NATO, you'll get a different answer, because many people believe, and many officials will tell them, that if Canada signed the ban treaty, we wouldn't be able to be in NATO. We would have to withdraw from NATO. And I don't think that's true, but there's mixed opinion about it. And so the majority of the population still wants to stay in NATO. If you combine those two opinions, questions, I think you're going to get a different answer than if you ask just in principle, would you like for Canada to sign it?
Yeah.
Okay, what would you get now? You say you've seen a poll recently of US opinion.
Yes. 2019.
And that was regarding the ban treaty, the TP.
I don't know whether they mentioned the ban treaty, but they did ask them whether they favored an international agreement to abolish all nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
And 49% of the US respondents said yes, 32% said no, and the rest didn't know. So I think we can assume that such a treaty, if ever proposed by US politicians, would be very popular.
Mhm.
And the opposition would be perhaps a third to 40% of the public. So um, imagine if there was mobilization of the public behind a nuclear weapons free world. I think you're quite right that people are for it, but they're not mobilized to demand it. And if they demanded it, I think the politicians would move forward on that score. They did during the 1980s when the public was mobilized to demand an end to the arms race and nuclear disarmament. And that's what followed at that point. And Reagan shifted. A variety of officials shifted their stance from nuclear buildup to nuclear abolition. And it worked very well.
And the public absolutely supported it, the,
Yes.
the cutbacks. And we're looking forward. In fact, I think that is, in a way, the sad part is people were so sure that Reagan and Gorbachev had handled it that, they stopped worrying. If
Right.
we should have kept them worried a little longer, if we could have.
Right. Well, that's the problem with reform movements. That is it. If you gain something, then you take the edge off the drive to change things. Right. If women's rights groups get women's suffrage, then the women mobilized back off, or at least some of them do, and the movement declines. Or if unions gain workers' rights, such as minimum wages and maximum hour laws and so on, then union militancy declines, and workers stop going to union meetings and so on. And the same's true with the campaign to ban the bomb. If people make gains, then they grow more complacent.
Hmm. Tell me about what is going on in the, well, I want to say the movement, but there ain't no such thing. In the U.S. Among people like us, is there any growing tendency to um, change the direction that the U.S. policies? For example, the U.S. continues, and I don't know under Biden, I don't think any of us are sure yet what he will do or want to do, even for sure. But the modernization of the U.S. arsenal
Mhm.
was going full blast under even Obama, although Joe Cirincione told us that he really wanted to stop it, but he was forced to do it in order to get the New START treaty
Right.
approved by the Senate. And he thought it was worth it and did it, that he agreed to this modernization. Now, that's a huge bundle of money that is still, as far as I know, being allocated to modernizing the nuclear arsenal. Tell me what's happening politically on that. Is there much of an effort to make them change course on that issue?
Well, the Democrats in their campaign platform, and Biden, uh, in terms of his history and his campaign promises, um, seem to be moving in the direction of cutting back, although not eliminating the modernization program, that is, getting rid of the plans underway by the Trump administration for building certain new kinds of nuclear weapons, and cutting back the costs of that program. Biden has also spoken in the past and in the recent past for um, no first use of nuclear weapons. And he may go beyond Obama on that score. I wouldn't guarantee it, but he's talked up for that. And furthermore, the people he has chosen to head up the arms control and national security apparatus at the lower levels dealing with nuclear weapons, for example. I'm not talking about Secretary of Defense, but the people who will actually deal with nuclear arms control and disarmament treaties are nuclear doves. They favor no first use. They favor cutbacks in the modernization program. They favor um, uh, continuation of the New START treaty, which Biden has already arranged with Putin. So I think that the direction of the Biden administration will be toward as much nuclear arms control and disarmament as he can get. I don't think the Biden administration or any significant portion of the Democratic Party is ready for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons.
Mm,
But I think we're going to see the continuation of the drive for nuclear arms control and disarmament that was begun by the Democrats in the past, was by and large continued under Obama, and is likely to be extended under Biden.
hmm. Okay. I've had two conversations on these talk shows recently that have some connection to the notion of no first use, which, by the way, I think the U.S. is now calling sole purpose. In other words, the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is deterrence,
Right.
which would mean, of course, that things like threat use for tactical weapons that are based in Europe. Those, there'd be no reason to have those. But one of them was a conversation with a guy named Gregory Kulaki of the Union of Concerned Scientists, who was in Tokyo, and he had to call me in the middle of the night, 3 a.m. or something, to be on schedule for this thing. But he was saying that there was a big effort on the part of the Japanese government to try to persuade Biden not to go for this sole purpose
Right.
commitment because the extended deterrence, Japan claims, is under the so-called nuclear umbrella.
Right.
And that would be true of, I guess, a lot of other, not a lot. How many other countries do you suppose might actually go as far as the Japanese government in saying, please keep your nuclear weapons because we like being made safe by them?
Well, in fact, though, um, the NATO nations are, I don't think that there's any NATO nation yet, and of course, those are nations that are under the US nuclear umbrella that has signed the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons.
Right.
So I think it's pretty clear that they at least want to stay on that under that nuclear umbrella and don't support the treaty, at least at this point. Now, it may be that one or more of them will break free, where the public really doesn't like nuclear weapons. For example, the Netherlands or Belgium or Denmark, perhaps. And
Germany,
that may open the floodgates to other NATO nations supporting the.
Germany would be the make the difference.
Oh, certainly would, yeah. But I don't think the Germans are rushing to do that. Maybe they would. I don't know.
Uh, okay. The other conversation I had that was relevant to this was with Sergei Rogov in Moscow, who used to be the head of the USA Canada Institute.
Mm-hmm.
Very concerned about, in fact, maybe I should do something to try to help publicize this effort that he's made. He held about 20 webinars with very distinguished people by Zoom about the growing threat between NATO and Russia, especially nuclear. And they came up with a document which had a number, I think it was a 10-page document or something, but it was a set of recommendations for ways of making the risk less. He said, we can't get rid of the Cold War now. It's just, wishing that it would go away is one thing, but it is here. Cold War is back, but we can reduce the risk of nuclear war, even given the political tensions between Russia and the US in particular, or NATO in general. And so he has a number of recommendations, which I think should be circulated widely. And one of the things, we had a show even last week where I had some Canadians and an American who, and Alan Ware in Prague, in this conversation. And he has, I think he said it now, 160 signatories, and he's going for big names. All of these people are people like former foreign ministers or former, people really expert on this. Very distinguished list of endorsers. And I think maybe we should take that document and do what we can to put it to other organizations throughout North America and Europe, and try to get that as a paper that people would, at least they could, almost everybody could endorse that. Even I think a lot of the people who would not support with withdrawing nuclear weapons or signing the ban treaty, a lot of them, in fact, that would go for Russia too, because Russia's not going to sign the ban treaty by a long shot.
Right.
But there's a chance that the Russians would undertake some, confidence building measures and um, other measures to reduce the threat. I don't
Right.
know. Are you in touch with organizations that are looking for means of mobilizing public opinion?
Oh, yes. And in fact, when you talk about the revival of Cold War tensions, um, there's a new group formed in the United States called the Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy. And they're very concerned about the tensions in the South China Sea and involving Taiwan. Um, that have developed between the United States and China, risking nuclear war. the um, Both sides there are armed with nuclear weapons, and they're very dangerous confrontations between U.S. armed warships and Chinese armed warships and U.S. Um, planes carrying nuclear weapons, um, planes that have been um, flying very close to the Chinese mainland, as well as close to Russian territory too. So that uh, there's a lot of work to be done to ease those tensions. Let me just add one other point. Um, in all we say about nuclear weapons, I think most of the problem developed out of the conflict among nations. And that conflict has to do with this sense that the best defense is to have the most powerful weapons. Um, and so we really need to go beyond just nuclear arms control and disarmament, although I'm thoroughly in favor of that, to um, to a strengthened international security system, wherein Russia doesn't have to worry about the United States, and the United States doesn't have to worry about Russia, and China doesn't have to worry about the United States, and these conflicts, as in the South China Sea, can be settled by some sort of international or multinational authority. Um, Technically, the UN should be doing that, but practically, the UN has never been given the power and the resources to settle disputes, particularly settle disputes among the great powers,
Mhm,
because the great powers just veto that sort of thing.
mhm.
So, um, at the same time, we're working for nuclear arms control and disarmament. I think we should also be thinking about and working for a strengthened international security system that can resolve these conflicts so that no nation feels threatened and that aggression becomes much more difficult
Mhm.
in the modern world.
Well, yes, but I don't want to speak against that, but what might occurs as I think about it is the difficulty of separating out security issues from more general value issues or human rights issues, etc. Because on the one hand, we absolutely do want to make, I would think many of us would want to make some sort of agreement about how we will settle any kind of potential military confrontation and prevent anything of that kind. Uh, but at the same time, some of these other real disputes about other matters continue to mount, whether it's in the U.S. A question about trade relations and intellectual property rights and things, that there are financial uh, interests involved, or certainly human rights and China. So how can we separate these damn things? Issues about human rights or economic Huawei, whether or not we want to join the Five Eye or allow the Chinese not Five Eyes, but 5G technology to be used in Canada, etc. Those considerations have one orientation where we have real conflict, but how do we disentangle that from the South China Sea issue, where there's a chance that somebody's going to start shooting at somebody else?
Right. Well, it's very difficult, and I think it's particularly difficult when individual nations are competing in the world and calling one another names and so on. Often names that are justified, but nonetheless, the Chinese government can say, "Well, Canada does this to its native peoples," and so on and so on. So I think it's much better if there's a respected global body such as the United Nations or a strengthened United Nations that criticizes China for its policy toward the Uyghurs, but on the other hand says that the South China Sea situation must be settled peacefully through negotiations, and establishes a body to adjudicate the conflict and make a determination as to what should be done. I think China would be under much greater pressure and would feel much less loss of face if it gave way to the United Nations rather than giving way to Canada or harsher adversaries. So again, I think that these conflicts are difficult, but they're best settled and resolved by an international body rather than by individual nations
But
in a
that
kind of
means,
Wild West scenario.
yeah, I think you and I both have the same wish lists on that, except if we fill in the blanks of what exactly needs to be done to create the institutional arrangements at the United Nations for such a change, then of course I have a lot of blanks. I mean, the potential for getting rid of the veto in the Security Council does not look very promising,
Right.
very likely. We would have, I think it maybe more possible would be the creation of a parliamentary assembly at the United Nations, an
Yes.
additional house. I don't think that's out of the question, uh, although I'm not knowledgeable to have an opinion really. But I don't think that would do any good unless you had either a world court or the Security Council in a position to implement whatever decisions parliamentary assembly might come up with, which would, I think, more likely to be democratic and just than the current arrangement. But what are the prospects for the UN reform that would make our joint wish list realistic?
Well, I think that clearly there are nations that have something to lose in terms of their power in running the UN or in keeping the UN weak and reciprocally keeping themselves dominators of world affairs. But nonetheless, I think that's what should be focused on far more than it's being focused on now. That is, I think we can't keep assuming that the United States or China or some other great power is going to set things right on the world scene. I think we have to assume that they need to be reined in by a multinational body that will have legitimacy in the eyes of the world rather than any nation that sets itself up as the arbiter of the world's future.
Mm-hmm. Yes, okay. That is where we pretty much have to leave it, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
It's kind of, excuse the expression, pie in the sky.
Maybe it is,
Yeah.
but So are
I
all the
wish
great dreams.
I wish we could come up with a much more concrete plan, you and I. Here's how we're going to fix the world. Step one, we do this, and I'll have that done by next week. And then you're supposed to do this, and please have it done by next a week from Monday. And but we do have some, we, in a way, potential for strategizing how mm, old old activists who are long in the tooth but still fire in our belly, how we can help reignite a passion for uh, nuclear abolition. That's, you know, how can we how can we do what we can, what's possible best to make that happen?
Absolutely.
Do you have a game plan?
Oh, well, now you give me a really tough question.
Yeah.
um, well, in a way, just to bring things back to the last point, but also answer your question. Um, it seems to me that most people recognize that nuclear weapons pose a great danger to the world. So we don't have to convince them of that. We have to convince them that there's something that can be done so that they no longer pose a great danger to the world, and that there's an alternative just to this government or that government scrapping its nuclear weapons, however virtuous that might be. Uh, and that is that uh, we have an international plan to see to it that no country maintains nuclear weapons anymore, that no country develops nuclear weapons, that international conflict is resolved, short of war and short of nuclear war, certainly. So I think we have, again, to go back to my last point, we need some kind of international security system brought into the argument for a nuclear free world. We can't just say nuclear weapons are bad, and people say, well yes, of course, and then say, and therefore we're going to get rid of them. I think that argument will only go so far. We have to extend it somewhat and say, and here's how we can do it. Here's a practical plan for seeing to it that your nation isn't threatened anymore by nuclear war, that the major conflicts, or certainly conflicts among nuclear powers, are stopped short of war, and so on. Otherwise, it does seem to many people that we are talking pie in the sky, that we're saying something that would be a good thing, but they don't see any chance of that happening.
Okay, I take your point, and I think there's another side of the thing, though.
Mhm.
I don't think we can forget the fact that there are really vested interests in nuclear weapons. I mean,
Oh,
as
yes.
I understand it, in the U.S., every state, they've made sure that every state has some installation that where there are jobs involved in production or testing, or doing something with the nuclear weapons establishment, and therefore the votes are there by people who would lose their jobs. And so we have to think of not only trying to figure out alternative jobs for people if they do lose their jobs in the weapons industry, but also put pressure on investment, because there are big companies that, good people have their money invested in outfits that produce, uh, you know, uh, uh, are the manufacturers of components and so on. So this thing about move the nuclear weapons money out
Mhm.
of investments in banks that that fund these installations and so on, as well as working with labor organizations maybe to try to um, not just say, well, let's shut down this operation here in your state, but let's
Mhm.
create uh, a new say climate change uh, or health institution that will provide jobs for those people who are going to lose out. So I kind of think we have to look at both, you know, a good reason to be afraid of nuclear weapons and want to get rid of them, but also the good reason to take care of the people who would be disadvantaged.
Oh, absolutely. And in that sense, it's much like the situation, the climate movement, environmental movements dealing with when it comes to the climate catastrophe. Namely, um, how do you build alliances with people and unions that are locked in to coal mining and to oil production and so on? And how do you convince those people um, that whatever gains are made are not at their expense? And here in New York State, for example, uh, the the state has developed a major project off Long Island for the development of wind power uh, that's going to employ very large numbers of workers uh, building windmills there offshore. And some of those jobs are actually coming to my city, Albany, where they're going to build the propellers, I believe, for the
Oh,
windmills. Um, and already in labor circles, that's being discussed here. Um, and where that's going to be done and how many jobs and the apprenticeships and so on. So you can get people lined up behind those things if you offer them a reasonable alternative. And as early as um, the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s, people like Seymour Melman, for
mhm.
example, um, who was a professor of industrial engineering at Columbia University, but also the president of the National Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy, was championing an alliance with the labor movement as to a conversion of nuclear weapons and military facilities so that workers didn't lose their jobs. And he built a close alliance with William Wimpsinger, the president of the International Association of Machinists. The machinists having a large chunk of those military production jobs, and got Wimpsinger to support conversion from military to civilian production. So it can be done, and I hope it is done.
Well, let's make it happen.
Okay.
I'm enthusiastic again. It's been so much fun getting back in touch with you and not only reminiscing about the past, but strategizing a little bit about how we're going to move it forward. It's wonderful. So,
Okay. Thank you, Meta.
okay,
And I look forward to further broadcasts that you do.
too. Okay, bye bye.
Bye now.